What was like the first drum machine or like production equipment that you started producing tracks on?
I went to a school called the Institute of Audio Research, and this was after college. And when I finished my coursework there, I got what was an Alesis, some kind of sequence. I can't think of the name of it. It was really small.
Was it almost like a keyboard, like a controller
It was
almost?
a keyboard sequencer, is what
Yeah.
it was. It was like a HR16, something that kind of name. I had a Casio keyboard that was MIDI controlled, and then
Okay.
I had a Akai SO1 sampler, which was really a keyboard sampler. It wasn't meant for any long-term sampling. I had like
Oh,
I think 11 seconds total in the whole machine, and it had 8 banks of samples. So you were restricted to a certain number of sample per bank. So it was
uh-huh.
real. I was speeding samples, records up to make them fit. Like everything was.
Yeah.
That was my first. The sequencer was sloppy, so it wasn't tight. Like my beats weren't really locking in properly, but it allowed me to get my ideas out. So that
Right,
was my
right.
first setup. But really at that particular time, I was working on just getting the ideas down. So when I went to the studio, I had like the scratch pad. So when I went to the studio, I was using, I think they had Cakewalk, the SP1200, like those kind of things they had
Yeah.
going on. So I was able to use the professional stuff in the studio, but at home, that was my setup, kind of like a consumer kind of setup.
Kind of like make a makeshift type thing in
Yeah,
a way,
it was.
and it
It
gave you
was.
good practice for
It
when
did.
you went to the studio.
Absolutely. Yeah, I loved it, man. It really, the only thing that I was lacking was the ability to tighten up the drums. And I was able to, when I got my 1200, that was when I learned how to get my drums tight, once I got the
Yeah.
1200.
When you say tighten up your drums, what was it that the like Alesis and the the Casio was lacking as far as when you did your drum programming?
It was the way the sequencer had very minimal ways to kind of lock in onto a grid. You know how we lock into a grid today?
Right.
With this particular, whatever, it was almost like working unquantized, but the quantizing that it had in there would shift it to these exact numbers that didn't have a real scientific way of locking the beat. So if I was off on one snare, off on one
Uh-huh.
kick, that was it. There was no way to really change it.
It would
I could
throw the
shift
whole
it.
thing off.
Right. Yeah, and it felt, now interestingly enough, no one ever heard it as being sloppy. And people like today, because of things like Jay Dilla, people who introduced the idea of unquantized music, they probably would have heard it and been like, yeah, you were doing that stuff before, because it felt kind of that slop groove, is what a lot of the beats were at that time that I was working on. But it wasn't what I was going for.
Yeah, at the
It just
time you
happened to
didn't
be
like it because
what
you wanted it to be locked in.
locked in. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really interesting how things can shift, in different
absolutely.
different eras and stuff, and
Yeah.
people come out and innovate things.
hmm